Welcome everyone to another Training Tuesday. My name is Justin Vasquez with the JL Jones Group, and today we have special guest Aubrey Wanetsky joining us to talk to us about glass wall systems. This class is going to go over, just like I said in the email, glass wall systems, how to order them, how to specify them, some problems that you might run into in the field, and some problems to avoid when scheduling these for your projects. This is an AIA class. The course ID is listed below here. The CEU credits are also listed here. If you will, please share with me your AIA number, either in the chat window or in a separate email, and we'll get those things registered and send a certificate out to you. Without further ado, I'll go ahead and let Aubrey take over the class. And I know some other people are going to join in, and I don't think that it should bother anything. So go ahead, Aubrey.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I want to first thank you by being here and for allowing me to present to you today on glass wall systems. Just a brief history on me. I've been in kind of the door industry for a little over 20 years. My career started with Stanley Black & Decker, and I worked for them in management and on the automatic door side of things. I came over to Dorma, started working with architects, which was a whole new world for me. And the hiring manager at that time told me, "You're going to talk a lot about glass." And in my mind, I was thinking, okay, glass, how much could you possibly talk about glass? And then I got hired, and then I started working with architects, and I quickly learned how much I would be talking about glass. So without further ado, I will get into the glass wall systems presentation. I am a spec writer for Dormakaba. I write specifications for our interior glass products and our automatic doors. So this is kind of the world I live in. So in this presentation, I'll kind of be giving you kind of my viewpoints from a specification standpoint on kind of what things to look out for. So in today's presentation, our learning objectives, we're going to talk about both fixed and movable glass walls. We're going to talk about the different types and why you might choose one type for a particular application over another. We're going to talk about design options and issues, specification issues, and then just kind of your standard industry issues with glass installers. So there are different types of glass wall systems, and we'll be going through the two types here, and we'll take a break after each one of these sections, and I'll ask if there are any questions. So if you have any questions, I'll ask you to hang on to those, and then I'll break for those. But we're going to talk about fixed glass wall systems, which will include patch fittings, rails, and single point or spider fittings. And then we'll move into movable glass wall systems, where we get into stacking, bifolding, biparting, and bottom rolling. So there is a group, and it's called GANA, G-A-N-A, and it stands for the Glass Association of North America. And GANA is a group of kind of industry leaders that put together just kind of some general rules that we should all follow. I know that when I'm writing a specification, if you came to me and said, "Hey, I want to make this glass door 13 feet tall and I want to only use 1/2-inch glass," I'm going to defer back to GANA and tell you, we probably shouldn't do that for the following reasons. GANA recommends that we stay within these heights. So GANA is, it's not a code, it's not a law, it's not anything that we have to follow to a T like that. However, they are recommendations, and you will find that many glass fabricators will not fabricate glass pieces outside of GANA recommendations. So these are the 4 glass door types that GANA has kind of given names to. So you've got type P, BP, A, and F, and we'll go through these a little bit more and kind of the pros and cons of each style. So here we have the P style door, and this is, I would say you're probably going to see these, if I had to take a guess, probably 80% of the time. And a BP style door means that you've got a rail on the top and a rail on the bottom. With this door, GANA will allow you to go to about 108 And I know we see doors much taller all the time, and you can push those limits a little bit. And we'll talk about that a little bit more throughout the presentation. But with these doors, this gives you the most adjustability. So you can go from left to right, in and out, top and bottom. You have a lot of adjustability on how that glass sets in these rails. With top and bottom rails, you are staying within ADA compliancy, and you do have space to mount hardware. So if you needed to use a Maglock, you've now got that top rail that you can mount to. So a lot of good reasons why these are probably used most often. A BP style door, as a matter of fact, I just specified one of these yesterday. The architect that I was speaking to was concerned. I'm in California, so a lot of the projects I work on are in California. And California, as some of you may know, we're very strict about ADA, and it even boils down to we have our own codes as it pertains to ADA in a lot of ways. So this particular client was concerned about having a patch fitting on the bottom and that not technically meeting ADA as far as that 10-inch bottom clear smooth requirement goes. So we chose to use a bottom rail on this door and then to use a patch fitting at the top. So still staying very, very much within code, but also allowing for that really unobstructed view of the glass. With this type of door, you're only going to be able to use a floor closer unless in this situation we were to use something like a floating header. But these are most often used with floor closers. This is going to have a little bit less adjustability when it comes to setting the glass. You're really only going to have a little bit of adjustability up and down. And then moving on, we have this beautiful picture of an A-style door. And an A-style door is just patch fittings top and bottom. So when I look at this picture, we see this very clean, very sleek looking door. However, there's not a lot of options if you needed access control with this door, or if you needed to lock this door somehow. There are some options, but we're going to add a little bit of bulk to that door if we needed to do so. With this type of door, you're going to be limited on the size. GANA recommendations, the height, the maximum for this type of door is about 102 inches. And the adjustability is going to be very, very little, really only a little bit of up and down with the glass. And then lastly, we have the F-style door, and that's going to be a patch fitting at the top and a patch fitting at the bottom, but you also have a patch that contains a lock in the bottom. And if I can get my cursor, there we go. Right here is where that lock patch would be. So basically you're just adding a spot where a cylinder can be used on this door where you can lock it. This, I would say I've probably only specified this a few times, only because, you know, my first concern would be ADA, having to have someone get down to the bottom of that door to kneel down and to lock it. So it's not used very often. This is kind of what a patch fitting looks like. So you have, it's generally, depending on who the manufacturer is, but they're going to be about 2 by 6. And you actually prep the glass for the patch fitting to lock or to be mounted through to give you a secure hold of the glass. So this is kind of a cut of what that looks like. Some of these patch fittings come, as we can see here on the left, we've got 3 of these covers, and some of them come, they're stainless steel fitting, but they come with a plate that can be mounted, and that plate can cover, you can pick different finishes. You can leave that cover off during construction. So, you know, if you're afraid that something's going to be damaged, you leave the cover off, the door can be fully functional. And then at the point that the job gets turned over, you can add that new add the cover back on, and you know, you avoided that getting damaged. The covers, they snap on, they can snap off. If you wanted to change the finish, you could do that, or if they, again, if they got graffitied or damaged in any way, you could easily swap that out. So that's kind of a nice feature on those. Now we get into rails, shapes, and sizes. And there, I always say with this photo, I don't know if this is a good representation or a bad representation. I'll let you guys be the the judge of that. But when I look at this picture, the first thing that jumps out at me personally is I see that we've got probably a 4-inch top rail there and a 4-inch top rail on the bottom. And then you've got just a U-channel on the fixed lights. Now, it looks nice on the fixed lights. I'll give them that because you don't have a lot of bulky hardware, but you've definitely got this difference in kind of sight lines. So you've got this rail here and then doesn't really match up here. So that's the first thing I notice. So rails, you can get rails that will match, that can hold their side light rails, and they basically hold the fixed lights of glass. You can get those to match the same rails that you're using on the door. But they come in a variety of different sizes and a couple different shapes. So as we move into looking at these rails, the different sizes and shapes, as you can see, you'll find rails anywhere from 2.5, 3 5/8, 4 inches. I've seen 4.5, 6, 10, and I've even seen 12-inch rails before. The general rule of thumb is if you're using a 10-inch rail, it should be square. And then if you go for ADA purposes, if you're using anything less than 10 inches, that rail needs to be tapered at a 60-degree angle. So as you can see, you can use something like the 2.5, can keep that really small profile height on the rail, but it has a taper, so you're staying within ADA. So I think I often kind of get from architects that there's kind of this this idea that you have to use a 10-inch bottom rail, but you don't. You can go smaller, it just has to be tapered. So how these rails work. So this is a picture, it's from 1949, and it shows kind of one of the first Herculite style doors. I know some people still refer to them as Herculite doors. I was not around in 1949. However, I did use this type of wet set rail. When I was back in the automatic door world, we used this type of rail to mount glass for our automatic all glass doors. And it was a real pain because we'd have to order the glass and order the rails, and then we'd have to have guys come in and spend generally a whole day setting the glass into the rails. So they'd come in, they'd take the bottom portion of the glass and they'd sand it just to give it enough kind of grit so the cement would hold on to it. We'd set the door or the glass into that rail, let it sit overnight. Then they'd come back the next day and they'd do the same process. They'd flip the door over and do the same process on the other side. So it was a very, very labor intensive process. And with an automatic door, we're looking at 4 panels just to make up one door. So they'd have to do that. They'd spend the whole day, come back the next day, spend the whole day. Then the door was finally ready to be installed. And heaven forbid that piece of glass break at some point, or since again, I know I mentioned I'm in California. In California, some of these doors that were exposed to different weather conditions, heat. Eventually, sometimes this cement would kind of erode and the glass would slip out of the rail. And in that case, you know, the building is left really without security. So it was a process. You'd have to board everything up, bring the rails back in, and start all over with a new piece of glass. And the problem is, and I don't know about you guys, but in my career, I've yet to see a perfect opening. So you'd set these rails, you'd get them out to the job site, and unfortunately, the flooring was off, or the opening wasn't plumb and square, and there's no adjustability. Once these things are cemented in, they're done. So that kind of took us to the second generation of rails. And this was a little bit better in a lot of ways, but really there were still some problems with this. So with the second generation, it required a hydraulic press, and these were a press-on type rails. So you'd set the glass in, you'd use this hydraulic press, you'd press the rail onto the glass, and go from there. So much quicker. It didn't take all day. It didn't take 2 days. But again, you're kind of faced with the fact that if the glass isn't just right, you have no adjustability. So once you take that out to the job site, if it isn't just perfect, you're not in good shape. And you had the price of buying the hydraulic press. So that brings us to the third generation, which is what most manufacturers are using now. And the current generation is a mechanical channel that basically just requires like an Allen wrench. You set the glass in, you tighten the Allen wrench, it clamps onto the glass, and You can do this in the field. You can do this in under an hour. You can adjust the glass. This is really kind of the best solution we've found yet. So these rails work very, very well, much better than the hydraulic and the cement type of applications. Now moving into headers. So every door, it's going to need a closer somewhere, and one of the areas that we can house a closer is overhead in the header. So headers come in a few different sizes. You can get 4 1/8, 4 1/2, or 6 inches, kind of depending on what kind of framing you're trying to match up to or what you've got going on inside of the header. But inside that header, we can put the overhead closer. We can put shear locks or electric strikes. All of those items can be housed inside this header. So you've got the portion that goes over the door. So that's what we're looking at right here. And then if you had the door and some fixed lights, like what we looked at a few slides back, what you can use is you've got that header, and then you've got the snap-on cover for the closer. And then you can have the glass channel, the glazing channel that will run along the fixed lights of glass, and that will hold the light of glass that you have there. So kind of neat that you can keep that same profile, run it the whole width of that door and the fixed side lights, and keep everything looking very universal. So I often run into situations where I'm asked, we'll go back to that 13-foot door. And I get asked for really, really tall doors that kind of exceed GANA guidelines, or doors that, yes, you could probably make them very tall, but then they're so heavy that people can't open them. So when we run into those situations, a floating header is a really good solution in that area. So if you want the look of a very tall door, or you have this transom above a door, but you can't put a you can't use a floor closer. You have to, for whatever reason, you can't recess into the floor, or this door looks like it has a maglock on it. For whatever reason, we have a floating header. So you can use a floating header to house the closer, maglock, shear lock, electric strikes, and still keep a glass transom above, or still maintain that really kind of illusion of a tall door. This picture is a really good example of how you can use a floating header. And I say really good example because with most floating headers, if you have glass on either side and you just have the floating header in the middle, normally you will have some type of electrical that's going to come down here on this butt joint between the glass. And unless you have a really good installer, it's kind of hard to conceal that. I mentioned this example as being good because from here, you can run the electrical here behind the wall and then pull it across through this header, and everything is concealed. So this is a great example of how that can look. Single point fittings. So this is still falling under the fixed wall systems category, and single point fittings are just another way that you can mount glass. We see it a lot in structural glass. I'll show, these are just some examples. They're really hard to see. I feel like these pictures don't really do these products justice. So I'm going to go to the next slide, which I happen to think is a little bit better. So this image here shows some really tall pieces of glass, and they're so tall that we've actually got some fins, some stabilization fins up here at the top. So it leads me to believe we're probably looking at something a little over like 12 feet, 13 feet, which is why we've got those stabilization fins. But just another way to hold glass together without having a lot of framing, without having a lot of rails or fittings. You've got these nice, small, unobstructed fittings that give you a really clean look. We see, oops, I'm sorry, I thought there was another slide there. We see these a lot like on stairwells. I personally have not specified any of these, but I do know that you see them a lot in stairwells where they're using kind of that glass rail look. In offices, I've seen them interior and exterior a lot in structural glass. As we move into more on the fixed wall systems, I do work on a lot of projects where we have offices like this, where we're looking for something framed, something that can work with a swing door or a sliding door, and these systems are available. When we're specifying something like this, when we're looking at using something like one of these products, one of my first questions would be, do we have to achieve an STC rating? So do we have to worry about sound transmission? And depending on what that answer is, that kind of, moves us in the right direction as to which product we're going to use. So if we go back to this here, I can guarantee that these rooms here don't have an STC rating of much beyond like something in maybe the 20 range. And that's only because you don't have anything blocking the sound between these joints. You don't have this doesn't look like anything with like dual pane glass. So really the only value that you're going to get is whatever the glass itself gives. And regular monolithic tempered glass is really only going to offer an STC somewhere in the 20s. If we go back to this photo, as you can see, this has, you've got some vertical pieces here. It's got a little bit heftier framing, and this kind of system is going to offer you a little bit more as far as sound transmission abatement goes. This, you're looking at a patch fitting door, so there really aren't going to be any good seals, so you're not going to get the best sound transmission control there. So those are usually some of my questions. Some offices we've had, confidential conference rooms in like an attorney's office, or we're looking at something where we have to work with HIPAA. And for those, you need to have something in like the 40s or the 50s, which it's not going to look like this. It's going to probably look a little more like this. So that's one of the first questions that I ask. And there are systems out there that will get you the higher STCs. Again, you might just not get as clean or sleek of a look. Now we're moving into the movable wall systems, and these have become really popular in recent years. And some of the areas where I think I've noticed the biggest push for these systems to be used, we see them a lot in storefront, space division, and skyboxes. So storefront, I think we've all, if you've ever traveled and you've been to an airport, you kind of see like those Hudson, I think it's like the Hudson News, just kind of a sundries type store within an airport. And they have, one giant opening. They usually have like the grates that come down at night to secure the store. We do see these types of systems used there. So these systems are a fixed system, but if you want to open up that space, these panels, they can become kind of free moving, and you can slide and stack them to the side. So if we can all take a look at this picture here on the top in the center, it's a little bit hard to see, I apologize. But this is a system where it's kind of in the middle of being moved. So you've got two panels that make up the dual pair. So whenever they've got this system closed up and they've got that wall fixed, these two panels work as regular swing doors. Then when they want to open up this space and open up into the lobby here, what they do is you've got some pins that drop into the floor. They drop into dustproof strikes on the floor, so there's no track. What they do is they disengage those pins. The panel then can slide across the top track and slide to a stacking space. And I'll show you what the stacking space looks like. When it comes to skyboxes, we're seeing these everywhere in suites, all over different stadiums where they want to have these, particular skyboxes or suites. They want to keep that kind of indoor-outdoor feel, so they can leave them open, they can leave them closed, just kind of depending on weather. Here are just some more examples. Here's that same conference room. This is when the system's completely fixed. This is what it looks like. And this system here on the bottom right is where they've got the panels have been disengaged and they're being moved to their stacking location. And the stacking location can be anywhere. So if you wanted it to be right near that room and you can split it in half and have half the panels on one side and half on the other, if you want to move them all to one side, if you want to have those panels stack away and store on the other side of the building, that's a possibility. The possibilities are kind of endless. It all just depends on how much room and space you have to run that top track. Again, just some more examples. Here's that same conference room, but now we're standing in the lobby looking into that conference room, and we've now moved all the panels and they're stacking over here on the right. Again, another picture of what that looks like when everything's closed up. Here's an example. So if you, this kind of, from first glance, it just kind of looks like a system with a pair of doors and some side lights. And while it does work that way, if you wanted to completely open up this space, you could move these panels all 4 to one side or 2 to one side and 2 to the other. So they can still work as very fully functional swing doors if you need them to work that way. There are fully framed models available as well. So what we looked at previously was more of a, I won't say completely interior. Most of those are being used on the interior, but some are to divide kind of an indoor-outdoor space. But this, the fully framed versions, you can find some that are thermally broken. These are going to be when you really want protection from the outside elements. So this is an example of a fully framed unit. Just some more examples in retail. Again, this is kind of like what I've seen in like the airport type situations where you want a big area for people to walk in and out of throughout the day when the retail store is open, but at night you want to secure everything and close everything up. Just a couple more examples. You don't always have to have a full top and bottom rail. Some manufacturers will offer single point fittings, kind of like what we looked at a little bit earlier in the presentation. So if you really wanted to kind of open up that glass look, that's available as well. It works the same way, same stacking mechanism. And here's an example, and this one I'm going to have to, you guys are going to have to get real creative with me here because this is a little bit difficult to see, but and let me get my cursor. So here's the track where the lights, when they're in the fixed position, this is where those lights would sit. And then they slide along here, and then they go to this 2-track kind of an H sort of position or letter, and the panels will stack, and these panels stack here on this wall. This panel is a fixed panel, so while it integrates with that system, it is not part of that system, but this panel works with that system and has an automatic operator on it, so it still, you know, can be ADA compliant if need be. So this is kind of an interesting application here. These also come in a folding system. The folding systems are kind of nice because I know I just mentioned that stacking area where it kind of turns into a lowercase h, where it turns into the 2 tracks. With the bifolding system, everything stays on a single track. So if you don't have the space to run up on top that double stacking track, a folding system might be a better option. I'll go ahead and get into, we're still within the movable wall systems, but now we're getting into more sliding systems. So kind of the first, again, going back to the first generation of sliding doors, sliding glass doors, they were all kind of based on a bottom rolling or a bottom track system. A lot of people have gotten away from that bottom track, again, because you are required to have this bottom track in the floor. Most people like to have, you know, something trackless. You get a lot of dirt and debris, which will eat away at the rollers if you're using a bottom rolling system. So just not the best system out there for that. So we've kind of moved into more of the systems now are really a top track system. This is an example of a biparting door in a top track system. This one, you know, like I said, everything's up in the top track here, all the rollers. The only thing you're going to have down at the bottom is a little U-shaped guide, and it's hard to see, but it's right there, I promise. And this little U-shaped guide is just going to make sure that this door stays on track and it doesn't flop around. So that's one example, and this is a completely frameless here. And this one, if let's say you were using top and bottom rail doors, swing doors throughout a building, and you wanted to have a sliding door and you wanted to keep everything matching, you can go with something like this, where you have the bottom rails. And again, I feel like this picture is kind of a funny example because you would think if you were going to put rails there, you might have rails on these fixed side lights, but for whatever reason, maybe they're trying to match something else. Maybe there is a swing door somewhere else in this office that they want to match. But this is also another option that's available. This one obviously isn't using a U-channel guide. This one has more of like a pin guide. It's going to ride, it sits in the floor and then it rides in the bottom portion of that rail. The same way we use a floating header on swing doors is very similar to using a glass mount on a sliding door. So if you had a door, all of these systems, most glass systems are going to be based off of weight. So depending on the weight of the door will kind of determine how tall we can go or how wide we can go. And each manufacturer will have their own parameters on that. But glass mounting a door is a really good way to, again, if you have a nice big opening, but you can't make the door that tall, what we can do is we can bring down the door to a manageable size and we can glass mount it. So you still get a very similar aesthetic, but you're now making the door work within the parameters of weight constrictions. So really neat. You can also mount these on walls. They can be wall mounted, ceiling mounted, glass mounted. There are a lot of different options for many of these sliding doors. And again, everything's going to be in that kind of floating floating header there. And the only thing that you're going to have on the ground is just a little bottom guide. Okay, so hardware. So in the regular door world with hardware, there are so many different options. And we do have a lot of hardware choices when it comes to glass doors, but they are a little more limited. There aren't as many options, but we still need to pick handles and pulls. We still need to look at locks and exit devices and then closers. So these are some of the most commonly used pulls that I see. I would say the trend lately has been more of like a ladder type pull. If someone's looking for something that's maybe, something cost effective, we have these C-shaped handles. And if you go into something a little more designer, you've got tons and tons of options. You've got a lot of custom options available. But I would say 95% of the time I'm specifying something that looks like the ladder pull here on the left. When it comes to locks, there are only so many places you can put a lock on a glass door. So for a manual lock, we've got deadbolt bottom rails type of locks, which, we kind of mentioned. This is a lock and a bottom rail, or if you were using a patch fitting door, we would just have a patch here. Not usually my first recommendation. I will always bring up the fact that I don't feel like that would be ADA compliant. In some situations it can be allowed, but it's not always anyone's first choice. You've got key locks and jam locks and then a panel lockdown. I would say something like this or like this is pretty common. However, the most common, and what I'm seeing, again, industry trends have kind of gone this direction, is a locking ladder pull. So you have, and the great thing about a locking ladder pull is that you have the cylinder at an ADA height, so nobody's bending down. You've got cylinders, a cylinder on one side and a thumb turn on the other, and there are ADA approved thumb turns, so you don't have to worry about that not being compliant. And while this photo here shows one that technically wouldn't be ADA compliant, especially if you're in a region that's very strict about ADA, because you've got both sides going all the way down to the floor, so you don't technically have that bottom 10 inches clear. There are manufacturers that make them minus less 10 inches on the push side of the door, so you can still keep that door ADA compliant. They can also not only lock into the floor, but they can also lock into the head. So these are some really great options. These are great as well when you've got offices, some need locks, some don't. You can keep a consistent aesthetic throughout a building without and have different functionality on each of those doors. So these are really popular. They come in a number of different finishes. I know black, like matte black, seems to be a popular finish now. And depending on who the manufacturer is, you can get those in different finishes. When it comes to access control, we are very limited in how we can incorporate access control into a glass door. And really the three ways that we can do that is A, with a Maglock, B, with a shear lock, or C, with an electric strike. And we don't have a picture of the electric strike here, but these are the ways that you can do it. So Maglock, again, this is kind of preference, or maybe it's regional as to whether or not they can be used. With a Maglock, like I said before, you're either going to have to use a top rail so that the Maglock has somewhere to engage with, or you're going to need some kind of bracket. So very similar to the locking patch down at the bottom, you would need something similar on the top of the door to make sure that you have, again, somewhere for that Maglock to engage. A shear lock is going to work very much like a Maglock, except everything's concealed. So all of those parts are going to be concealed in the top rail of the door. But again, it requires you to have a full top rail. And the last option with an electric strike, the electric strike is housed inside the header. And with that, you can use patch fittings, you can use full rails. So that one is probably what I specify most often, just because if you're looking for something that really has the least amount of hardware, or visible hardware, I should say, the electric strike is a great option. There are exit devices available. I think we're all pretty familiar with kind of this tubular exit device. There are options to lock into the floor, lock into the head. Again, I never recommend they lock into the floor. I only specify locking into the head. These are some examples. This is the one that locks into the floor. I'd never recommend that. And then on the opposite side of the door, you have these options as to different types of pulls. So if you wanted to do kind of like a mirror finish for what you have, you can use this handle here, a bunch of different types of pulls. So this is the part where we'll talk about the automatic operators. So like all doors, we need some kind of way to control the door. So it's either going to be an overhead concealed closer, a floor closer, or the third option, which would be an automatic operator. So I think we're all pretty familiar with in-ground floor closers or an overhead concealed closer. Again, just depending on, if you've got the room to recess it in the floor. Overhead is generally cheaper just because there's less labor involved. But now with COVID and with everybody looking to make everything touchless, there's been a huge push towards automating these glass doors. So making everything touchless, making everything contactless. And this is where an automatic operator can come into play. With an automatic operator, there are 3 different mounting options, very similar to a closer. You have overhead concealed, you have surface applied, which is what we've shown here, and you've got an in-ground operator that goes in the floor here. These can all be a full energy or low energy, just meaning the speeds that they'll open and close. With glass doors, I almost always see them in low energy mode. But you can use them with a touchless push plate or a push plate that you actually have to depress. But again, in the world that we're living in with COVID, everybody's looking to go touchless. So there are touchless wave plates. You just wave your hand in front of it and the door will open for you. But yes, these can be incorporated. You just will need to make sure that you're using a top and bottom rail so that the door arm has something to attach to. As we move into options for glass, 1/2-inch tempered glass is pretty much the industry standard. But again, GANA has recommendations. So if you're looking to go with something a little bit taller, if you're looking to go over 9 or up to about 10 feet, then you might want to look at going with something like a 3/4 inch glass. That would be GANA's recommendation because it would help with deflection. You can use laminated products. We're seeing a lot of kind of requests for laminated. And then cast and kilned or like a textured glass can be used with these products as well. Some of the design options and issues with glass. I mean, we talked about this earlier in the presentation. It's glass and glass can break, unfortunately. So it's probably not the most secure of items that you can put in a building because you are always exposed to that potential of the glass being broken. There is minimal noise abatement. We talked about that too, unless you're looking for something that's got a lot of framing around it. You are going to have sound transfer. And then the question, or we talked about a little bit earlier, you are limited and restricted because these systems on an exterior of a building, you will have gaps. These systems inherently have small gaps. And we can do things to mitigate that. We can put, seals in between, you can put brush and felt and everything else. But again, if you're going for kind of this all glass look, and then you add all of these additional items, is that really what you're trying to do? Because it does kind of take away from that all glass look. We are limited to height. I mentioned that before because of deflection. When the glass bows, if you have 2 pieces of glass on a fixed section, you can push that glass and actually, pinch fingers in there. So it can be a little bit dangerous. So really most of these systems, you're going to have a 10-foot max. You have to add vertical stiles and things to help with the stability of that glass so that it just doesn't bow. ADA, we've talked about that throughout this presentation, so I won't go on too much on this slide. I would just say check with whatever opening forces are required, because again, these doors can get very heavy. Certain closers can only go to certain weights and won't allow for that 5 pounds or 8 pounds, depending on where you're at. Again, even with glass doors, we still need to keep in mind that we need to keep that 32-inch clear door opening. And now as we get to the end of the presentation, and since we've got just a few minutes left, I'll save all the questions until the end. But when it comes to specification issues, and these are the things that I will try and help you with if we were working together. But we want to make sure, because these systems are made out of glass, they're heavy, they do require some structural support. You do want to make sure that you're using high quality items and that you're going through the right people. You want to make sure that the installers have 5 years experience at a minimum. You want to make sure that you're using a reputable glazer and manufacturer. You want to get all the parts from one single manufacturer. With the glass wall systems, the movable systems, we like to recommend an hour training for the owner. So whoever's using these systems, we want them to know, how do they lock, how do they move, and how do you get them into those parking spaces. It's a good idea to look at doing a maintenance contract. Again, you want to avoid low quality substitutions, things that just really won't hold up and stand, the test of time, because these things are so limited by weight and load capacity. You want to make sure that you're using the right hardware and that you're not pushing the limits of what these products can do. And then on execution, you want to make sure that there is an inspection of the substrate. Again, this is really important when it comes to these top hung movable wall systems. You want to make sure that the installation is really coordinated and the structural frame and support is done properly, and that there is kind of some training on how to protect and clean these systems after construction.